fabrication of necessary illusions for social management is as old as history. But in the democratic system, the necessary illusions cannot be imposed by force. Rather, they must be instilled in the public mind by more subtle means. A totalitarian state can be satisfied with lesser degrees of allegiance to required truths. It is sufficient that people obey. What they think is a secondary concern. But in a democratic political order, there's always the danger that an independent thought might be translated into political action, so it is important to eliminate the threat at its root. Debate cannot be stilled, and indeed it should not be stilled in a properly functioning system of propaganda. The reason is that it has a system-reinforcing character if it is constrained within proper bounds. What is essential is to set the bounds firmly. Controversy may rage as long as it adheres to the presuppositions that define the elite consensus, and it should furthermore be encouraged within these bounds. That helps to establish these doctrines as the very condition of thinkable thought, and it reinforces the belief that freedom reigns. One crucial doctrine, standard throughout history, is that the state is adopting a defensive stance, resisting challenges to order and to its noble principles. Thus, the United States is invariably resisting aggression, sometimes what's called internal aggression. Accordingly, it's a logical impossibility that anyone should oppose U.S. aggression. That's a category that cannot exist. Westerners have no problem in perceiving the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as brutal aggression, but the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam in the early 1960s cannot be perceived as such. True, U.S. forces were directly engaged in large-scale bombing and defoliation in an effort to drive the population into concentration camps where they could be, as we put it, protected from the enemy whom it was conceded they willingly support. True, a huge U.S. expeditionary force invaded and ravaged the country and later its neighbors with the explicit aim of destroying what was clearly recognized to be the only mass-based political force and eliminating the danger of political settlement that was sought on all sides. But throughout, we were resisting aggression in our yearning for democracy. Throughout the war, there was no departure in the mainstream from the doctrine that the United States was defending South Vietnam. Unwisely, the doves came to believe. Years later, the doctrine remains beyond challenge, a most remarkable demonstration of the effectiveness of democratic systems of thought control. Similarly, in the case of Central America today, the United States is defending freedom in what are called the fledgling democracies and restoring democracy to Nicaragua. We find this view even at the extreme of expressible dissent in the elite media. In a bitter condemnation of the U.S. attack on Nicaragua, Atlantic Monthly editor Jack Beatty writes that democracy has been our goal in Nicaragua, and to reach it we have sponsored the killing of thousands of Nicaraguans. One could hardly find a more consistent critic of U.S. policy in the corporate media than columnist Tom Wicker of the New York Times. He condemns the application of the Reagan doctrine to Nicaragua because, in his words, the United States has no historic or God-given right to bring democracy to other nations. Critics assume without a second thought that a yearning for democracy has indeed guided U.S. policy towards Nicaragua since July 1979, when our client Somoza was overthrown, though admittedly we were not guided by this policy before the miraculously and curiously timed transformation took place. Central America has an evident interest in hounding the Sandinistas to honor their pledges to democratize, so the editors of the Washington Post admonish. There's no problem of ensuring democracy in the U.S.-backed terror states of Central America, firmly under military rule, behind a thin civilian facade. The same editorial in the Washington Post warns that from the incursions into Honduras in March 1988, it is plain what Nicaragua's threats to Honduras are. The reference is to military operations in northern Nicaragua, in which Nicaraguan forces, in hot pursuit of Contra invaders, penetrated a few kilometers into areas of Honduras that had long been ceded to the Contras. In the United States, These actions elicited renewed outrage over the threat of the Sandinistas to overrun their neighbors in the interests of their Soviet master. This heartfelt concern over the sanctity of borders is perhaps somewhat tainted by the curious conception of a border as a kind of a one-way mirror. So the sanctity of a border is not violated by U.S. supply flights to its proxy forces who have entered Nicaragua from their Honduran bases. But putting aside these matters, we can assess the seriousness of the concern by turning to the results of a controlled experiment that history obligingly constructed. Just as the free press was consumed with rage over this latest proof of the aggressiveness of the violent communist totalitarians in Central America, with major stories and angry commentary, our client state of Israel launched another series of its periodic operations in Lebanon. These operations were north of the sector of southern Lebanon that Israel has virtually annexed as a security zone, integrating the area with Israel's economy and compelling its 200,000 Lebanese inhabitants to provide soldiers for the South Lebanese Army, an Israeli mercenary force, as the Israeli press observes. The Israeli operations included bombing of Palestinian refugee camps and Lebanese towns and villages with large-scale destruction, dozens of people killed and many wounded, including many civilians. All of this was barely reported, and there was no noticeable reaction. The only rational conclusion is that the media outrage over the far less serious and more justified Nicaraguan incursion was entirely unprincipled, mere fraud. The absence of comment or even serious reporting of the Israeli actions in Lebanon is perhaps understandable. These operations were, after all, rather muted by Israeli standards. They do not compare with the murderous Iron Fist operations in Lebanon in 1985, or the bombing of villages in the Bekaa Valley a year earlier, with 100 killed and 400 wounded, mostly civilians, including 150 children in a bombed-out schoolhouse in one raid. These were reported, but without affecting the elevated status of Israel. This tiny nation, symbol of human decency, as the editors of the New York Times described it, just at the height of the repression of the current Palestinian uprising, with beatings, killings, gassing, and collective punishment. It is a country that cares for human life, in the admiring words of the Washington Post editors, in the wake of the Iron Fist atrocities. The fact that Israel maintains a security zone in southern Lebanon, controlled by a terrorist mercenary army backed by Israeli might, also passes without notice. And the same is true of Israel's regular practice of hijacking and piracy in international waters, and other actions that are rarely even reported. If Soviet Jews were to suffer the treatment meted out regularly to Arabs, or if some official enemy, such as Nicaragua, were to impose repressive measures approaching the Israeli standard, the outcry would be deafening. During Israel's March 1988 operations in Lebanon, there was no issue of hot pursuit. Israel is not an impoverished country attempting to survive the terrorist attack of a superpower and its lethal economic warfare. But Israel is a U.S. client, and therefore it inherits the right of aggression. Nicaragua, in contrast, is denied the right even to drive attacking forces out of its own territory. This is on the tacit assumption that no state has the right to defend itself from U.S. attack, another crucial doctrine that underlies responsible debate.